Just going to call in for the H. Yeah, I just need one to get started. Thanks. Hello, beautiful community. Is it possible to hear me and see me? Or is it not? Is it possible to hear and see me, or is it not? Happy Sunday. Thank you so much for popping in. Lots of love to you if you're watching this at a later point. We are going to have a chat that is a little bit more topic focused than usual. And we'll talk about Russian propaganda. Not just because it's an important topic, but also because Russian propaganda is evolving, and because with the 2024 US presidential election, we are going to need to think about it more and better and more soberly and with more clarity. Hi. So I'm presuming that you're hearing and seeing me. Is that a fair presumption, beautiful community? It seems like it is. It seems like it is. Hello. Hello. Seeing you too, hearing you too. Yulia, hello. It is. Is it? It is. Isn't it? It is. Stephen is in Kiwi land. I always feel ashamed about how little I know Kiwi land. One of my closest people in my life is really very much associated with that country, but I've only visited Kiwi land once, even though I've spent so much time in Australia. Nico's asking about my book on Isaiah Berlin. We're going to roughly skip over all non-propaganda questions, but the book is stalled. It's in motion, but it's stalled. And as I reported the other day, Isaiah Berlin's editor and literary executor, and Isaiah Berlin's everything in some ways, Henry Hardy, was just asking me that question too. Will he get a chance to read my book in his lifetime? I'm very passionate about that. But we are going to focus on Russian propaganda. There is a Russian propaganda video on the main channel that I felt a lot of you folks felt was a fairly useful guide, but it's 2 years old. It's still 90% useful, but it needs an update. And therefore, the next video on the main channel, hopefully slightly better produced than the last video on the main channel, which was just for health reasons a bit rushed, will be on Russian propaganda. And so 90% of our meeting is just to hang out on a Sunday and talk about Russian propaganda. Hello, 50-50 grind. But 10% of the purpose of this chat is for me to get a sense of what you're worried about, what kind of issues and concerns you have in respect of Russian propaganda, especially Russian propaganda hitting the West. Hello, Billy. Hello, Vladimir. Hello, Andy. Let's have a look. Bob was asking, do you think Soviet and modern Russian neediness for recognition by the US and by the West should be utilized as a carrot in negotiations? There's a lot to say here, but I'll say one thing. Russia and indeed the Kremlin are endlessly normatively dependent on the West. But normative dependence is different to desire for emulation. One way of being normatively dependent on something is to want to destroy it, right? I mean, here think about a very committed, dogmatic atheist who doesn't just take a view that denies the existence of God, but makes the denial of the existence of God an absolutely central issue in their ethical makeup. So Russia's normative dependence on us is in part expressed in wanting to destroy us, or wanting to be the opposite of us. Now, then there is another element here. I promised one point, but I'll make a second. There's another element here, and that is that there is a certain sense in which Russia wants to claim an inheritance from the West that the West has itself lost. This expresses itself in different ways. One of them is for the Kremlin to claim that they're more conservative than real Western conservatives who've died out. So that's a little bit on this important question, but of course there is much more. No children are being tortured in the background. This is my neighbor's little one. They must be out in the corridor and the little one is crying. Let's have a look. Question about motivating people to vote. One of the things I might do in the main channel, Video and Propaganda, is to give us a guide to roughly which different actors in our polities might do what better to be more resistant to democratic decline, and by extension, really, to be more resistant to Russian propaganda. And one of the things that worries me very much about the younger generation in the political process is that the political process at the level of political parties in particular feels kind of dead, uninspiring, rather mechanized, with parties being out to succeed, out to win, out to generate better outcomes, rather than being out to make ideological sense of the situation we're in, rather than out to try to bridge ideologies, rather than out to try to generate new ideas. So political parties are uninspiring to young people all across the board in the West. And of course, there's so much more to say, but this is just one point. Ivan is asking if I prefer Patreon or YouTube membership. Patreon membership is much better at the moment because YouTube takes a much bigger slice. Yulia is asking whether there is any evidence of the West trying to get the info of a possible bright future for Russia to the Russian people. No, absolutely not. And there is two ways to think about it. This often is something that generates toxic clashes online, because I myself actually do agree that from the West's point of view, the best way to fix the crisis we're facing is to support Ukraine in the first instance, rather than in the first instance try to aim for change in Russia. But having said this, I don't see a conflict there. You can easily do both. Trying to politicize the Russian space doesn't cost us anywhere near as much as supporting Ukraine costs us. It costs some energy, it costs some time, it costs minimal financial resources. But we're not doing it. And part of the reason we're not doing it is that the Russian opposition are not showing us clear paths about how to do it. And part of the reason the Russian opposition are not showing us clear paths about how to do it is that we don't look motivated to do it. It's a kind of a disappointing cycle. I think that what we want to do isn't to show Russian people a sense of a bright future, but to give a very clear picture of what we are ready to work with if it happens on that space and what we're not ready to work with. It needs to be actually more prosaic and more pragmatic than that. Pavel. And by the way, I am deliberately not starting this off with a sort of systematic talk um, on the challenges that Russian propaganda poses us, partly because I'm a bit brain dead at the moment, but partly because I want to not sort of um, direct repeated stuff at you, because that's going to be in the main channel video. Which I hope will be a useful resource to come back to a bit, as the previous video from 2 years ago has proved, and this one hopefully will be better. Pavel, hi Vlad, where's the line between entertainment and propaganda? Is Captain America Western propaganda? Public opinion is easily swayed, so any country can seem like it's on the right side of history, even if it's not. I think it's actually a really important category, Pavel, that you've raised, which is the category of intellectual, or even, if you like, ideological entertainment. And it's important to distinguish that from other kinds of political and ideological interventions. That does not mean that entertainment is harmless. Some entertainment can indeed be damaging, but to categorize something as entertainment means that you have a clear understanding of what kind of product it is and how to engage with it. You don't want to encounter an entertainer, an algorithmically motivated entertainer, for instance, like Russell Brand, and relate to them like you would to a committed right-wing or left-wing ideologue who genuinely starts with taking the ideas seriously on their YouTube channel in their newspaper column. So that categorization is very important. And my categorization of what constitutes entertainment is quite wide. And I'm afraid a lot of people who would think of themselves as analysts, I might categorize as entertainers. There is then another category, if you like. So there is entertainers, there's a category of analysts, public intellectuals might be in that category, but then there's also the category of advocates. And again, there is a good way and there is a bad way of being an advocate. And there's a lot of advocates doing an absolutely fantastic job. And there are some advocates who are doing a less than fantastic job, partly because they're advocating in a counterproductive way, or because they are hurting other values that aren't advocacy, like truth, too much in the course of their advocacy. And then there is something else, and that is that virtually all politics, most people to some degree take as being half real, as being populated by characters who are similar to characters you might encounter in a television soap opera. And so we end up with a situation where Biden, Zelensky, Putin are all folks we sort of take half seriously. We see as being half real and half characters in a drama that seems to be playing out in front of us that can't be taken entirely seriously. And so we might as well just get on with our own lives. So this idea of all politics being reduced to being, a soap opera with characters in whose reality we half believe is a very important thought, I think. Dan, how conscious do you think Western politicians are when they repeat Kremlin arguments? The more manipulative people who do it are absolutely conscious that they're repeating Kremlin arguments, but they're not repeating them except in very few cases so as to please the Kremlin. They're repeating them to meet their own entrepreneurial aspirations. If you abstract out of a particular issue or a particular statement and you put up two poles, one is that people are saying stuff that repeats Russian talking points because they're servicing Russia versus they've come up with that stuff themselves because they're just bad at coming up with political ideas, or more plausibly because entrepreneurially it makes sense for them to come up with these ideas, or because they're engaged in a certain democratically destructive project that indeed has nothing to do with servicing Russia, but borrows some Russian talking points. If you make that contrast, I would always emphasize the explanation in general that they're saying it for their own reasons rather than because they're servicing Russia. But some of them could be. And then there is something else. What are Russian propaganda talking points? How does this work? Well, the Russians are not trying to change our mind about anything. They're trying to generate ungovernability in Western countries by poisoning discourse that is already to some degree poisoned organically and domestically. So Russians, and this is part of the point of post-truth propaganda, which we'll discuss on the main channel video in a more systematic way. The point of their post-truth propaganda is that it starts with the subjective motivational set we already have. If you like broccoli, they're not going to try to persuade you that you should like zucchini instead. They're going to try to persuade you to do something with broccoli that is counterproductive. So, to a good extent, Russian propaganda is just an absorption, intensification, distortion of our own talking points, and then reinsertion into our polities of more poisoned versions of our very own talking points, which the Russians extracted from us and reinserted in a slightly more poisonous form into us. And all of these problems that we are having, they're going to get worse. So wherever we are with this challenge of figuring out our own democratic decline and Russia's attempts to exploit it and China's attempts to exploit it, wherever we are with that problem today, we will be in a worse place a year from now and a worse place a year from then. And this will carry on for quite a while. And that is why it's still worth thinking about this in terms of us being, a meter deep in the water. We're going to be 10 meters deep at some point with this problem. We won't sink, but it's going to be tougher. I'm going to have to look with more precaution and more uncertainty at the bottom, often without seeing the bottom of the water. And there'll be waves, there'll be medium-sized fish, no great white sharks, but medium-sized fish that could take a little bite out of us, maybe some little reef sharks. So that's going to be the trajectory. And that's why it's important to start talking about this early. And I have to confess that already Western citizens, and many of you, are absolutely freaking out about this. You're freaking out about the breakdown of our capacity to share mental worlds alongside our citizens, and you're freaking out about our incapacity to agree on elementary matters of fact. I know that is already causing, if you like, political anxiety on a big scale among a lot of us here in this room. And as I believe the problem is real, but isn't helped by us freaking out. Yes, Rachel, baby sharks. It's important to start talking about it early, because we cannot afford to freak out as much as we're freaking out 5 years from now, when the very same problems we've got now will be slightly worse. But could be less bad than they're going to be if we manage them more intelligently. And we're going to talk about this. So this is up to us to a good extent, right? The trajectory is negative, but it can go like this or it can go like that, depending on our capacity to respond. So Alex is a rogue is asking, what are the techniques to respond to this? And I think that what I may try to do briefly in the main channel video is say, what can political parties do? What can citizens do? What can journalists do? What can individual politicians do? I think that's useful. But I think just consciousness of how this stuff is working is very important. So, for instance, this aspiration of ungovernability is very important to understand, that that's what they're trying to attain here in the West. And that part of the intent of Russian propaganda in the West isn't just to depoliticize us, to pacify us, to make us unconstructive citizens. It's also to make us freak out about it and generate more toxicity in our own political systems via freaking out about Russian propaganda. So it's a little bit like somebody throwing in a few mice into their neighbor's house, hoping that the neighbor freaks out and causes a calamity in their own kitchen and breaks the window and capsizes the table. So that I think that that aspiration is very important, that they think that it's part of our democratic decline that we are going to react massively counterproductively to Russia's attempts to poison our polities. So it's very important to understand that aspiration so that we don't begin playing into their hands, and do their work for them. So one of the most important things here is, for goodness sake, to not become so determined to beat Russian propaganda in a counterproductive way that we end up doing their work for them. Daniel is asking, what do I think of Kraut's video on the ideological basis of Putin? And have I seen it? I think I haven't just seen it, I've responded to it on the chat channel. So just in case, Daniel, you haven't seen it, Vlad Vexler chat Kraut, and there's going to be a response where I really sort of somewhat pacify the idea, unless I misremember it, that Tim, the beautiful Tim Snyder, also emphasized a lot that Putin is interestingly thought of as being a follower of Ivan Ilyin and so on. I do not believe that. But I, at the same time, don't want that commentary on Kraut to be the final word. And there's 2 or 3 videos planned for the main channel, and one is absolutely on the nature of the ideology of Putinism. And the reason this is so important to get right is that, quite frankly, much of what I'm exposed to, if I look at academic literature, are accounts of the ideology of Putinism that aren't accounts of ideology at all. They're just accounts of stuff the Putin regime have said, political claims they've made. Well, that's not ideology, I'm afraid. You can't reduce ideology to this sort of empirical flatness. Ideology is stuff that swims around between people's minds. It's stuff that sits in people in a particular way. So ideology is part of an embodied and purposive way of people, in this case, Russian population, Russian citizens, going around the world about their world and reacting with images, feelings, thoughts. And I want to give you a list of what these items are. And they are sometimes items that the Kremlin names, but they're often items that the Kremlin doesn't name. So, a central feature of the ideological wash of the Putin regime is, for example, the idea that might is right. It is also contains a kind of radically hyper neoliberal idea that you should be able to buy anything, and if you can't buy anything, you might as well engage in force to get it. These aren't things that the Putin regime would claim. You can't sort of say, well, these are all the claims the Putin regime has made, and this is the claim they've made 473 times, the most frequently made claim, and therefore it's the most central part of Putinite propaganda, Putinite ideology. It's not. It's a central part of Putinite propaganda. And these, what I would call flat social science bits of research in Russia, are actually superb. Often they're superlatively done. But what I'm saying is that they capture something else, very informative, but something else, not quite what we would label as the ideology of the Putin regime. The only other point about Kraut that I would make is I'm not familiar with Kraut's earlier content, but some of the more recent content I've seen from Kraut over the last year or so, or 2 years, I've been very disappointed to see it restricted and demonetized on YouTube. I'm very disappointed in that. Dmitry is asking me if I've followed the work of Navalny's organization recently, in which they attempted to, if you like, repoliticize the 90s in Russia and tie the 90s to where we've ended up. Now, there is actually an interesting lecture on YouTube in Russian by Greg Yudin from a few months ago called How Everything Went Right. How some of what we saw in the 90s led to what we've got now as, in some way, being a logical consequence of it. I'm going to respond, I think, in a separate video to some of this stuff that Navalny's team have been doing. It is certainly an attempted politicization. It's been greeted with perhaps 40% praise and 60% criticism in that wash of Russian oppositional circles. And I haven't seen the full content because of my recent health reasons. I haven't seen all of their output, so I might want to do that before I respond and analyze it. But what Dmitry is talking about is the main segment of the Russian opposition, still bigger than any other segment, trying to, in a quite direct way, to repoliticize the 90s. And I will be making a comment on that. And Zelmas is saying the Russian Defense Ministry is fighting corruption. Navalny's dreams come true. Well, Navalny was a pro-Western Democrat, so and he's anti-war. So no, that's not his dream coming true. That's unreasonable. But what I would say about this enterprise is that Putin is facing the challenge of can he bring greater functionality to the military industrial complex and to the army without making the political system he is running itself more functional, which he can't do. So there is a certain question there about how far this is not just going to be running in a circle. Rachel is asking, is Keir Starmer a reliable ally for Ukraine? I don't think it makes much difference between whether the Conservative or the Labour Party is in power from Ukraine's point of view. I mean, it makes a difference, but it's not a vast difference because this is not a radically politicized issue in the UK. The biggest objection I have as a British citizen to Starmer, he's going to be my prime minister. I mean, personally, everything I hear and people in my life who've spent time with Keir have very positive things to say about him personally. But as a British citizen, I do not believe that Keir is telling me enough about how he's going to run the country. So Keir is doing defense politics in sort of American lingo rather than offense politics. And defense politics does not help with the crisis of trust. It can risk contributing to it. That's one of the biggest challenges. And that's reflected in the current position of the Labour Party on Ukraine, which is wishy-washy. It's not our aspiration, whether we can do it or not, is this, and for that particular reason. It's wishy-washy. I'm exaggerating, but it's not enormously better than we're going to help Ukraine for as long as it takes. That's not good enough strategically, even under the constraints of democratic incapacity they often talk about applying in the West. But apart from this wishy-washiness and strategic evasiveness, the UK will be comparatively a good ally for Ukraine. Jacob. Rory Stewart, armed with your key and concise talking points about democratic distrust, could be PM. Interestingly, I haven't read all of Rory's book. I think, Rory hasn't spent an enormous amount of time in that book trying to give an analysis of why there is the kind of crisis of trust and crisis of politics there is. And partly that's because that's not the kind of book it was. But intuitively, Rory has a pretty good sense of where things are at. Unlike Rory, I'm not a conservative, but it doesn't matter these days, really, where one is. What matters is whether one grasps what the hell is going on, or whether one still is pretending that one is in 1998 and we can proceed with the politics as it appeared before. And so on all of that, Rory gets all the ticks. And especially in the current environment of such low quality of political representatives, Rory stands out in gravitas in the UK context, but that's in part also commentary about the rest of the people in UK politics. Yes, I do believe that there is space. Zonko is asking, is there space and does the West engage in covert anti-Russian propaganda? And if not, should it? There's a recent piece, long piece in The Atlantic by Anne Applebaum that touches on this. The answer is we're doing a bit, but we're doing very, very little. We're perhaps doing a bit more to tackle Russian propaganda on the international stage than we are domestically, but we're doing very little. And we don't have a clear strategy about what to do. And what we should do breaks down into two buckets. One bucket is about taking on Russian propaganda. And one way of taking it on isn't just to challenge it, but to take initiative, right? So this is one of the problems we've had. We always do a sort of counter reaction response, whereas we need to lead a bit more, right, with our own messaging. But that's one bucket, trying to respond reactively or proactively to Russian propaganda. But another bucket is very important to say as a footnote to your question, which we mustn't forget, is that making ourselves more solid democratically, just making sure my mic is still on, is the single most important thing we can do to make ourselves resilient to Russian propaganda. In other words, to tackle the domestic causes of the poison that the Russians are trying to magnify inside our societies is the single best way, domestically at least, of dealing with Russian propaganda. But again, back to your question, we're doing very little, we can do more, and what we're doing tends to be reactive rather than proactive. Johan, good to see you, and thank you. Seeing some fantastic questions. I want us to stay focused on the topic of propaganda on this occasion. But I will take any questions that are about the last main channel video because it's so recent. I'm not frozen. I'm reading. I'm slow. Lampredi is asking about the situation with Viatcheslav Morozov, the Russian scholar who'd been in trouble recently in the Baltics. And I am not privy to sufficient factual information to take a view. However, I'm obviously very concerned about anything going on in that case that might impact academic freedom. But again, I simply do not have any information about that that allows me to comment, and I have not seen what recent developments have occurred. So if something has changed in the last few weeks, partly because of my health, I've actually not noticed. So, but if you're asking me whatever happens now, does that taint the books? No, absolutely not. Even if you reject the thesis of the books about certain mode of self-colonization, if you like, in Russia, it's a very interesting thesis that you could reject for stimulating reasons or accept. So the books remain recommended, no matter what the facts turn out to be. Malfitano, thank you for boosting Zonko's question. How do I expect Russian propaganda to act in the future after the Ukraine? Well, the Ukraine war could be going on 10 years from now. So that sense of after we have to be conservative about. The key enterprise is ungovernability and democratic collapse in the West. That will not change until the nature of this regime changes in Russia. That will not change. And the way this gets pursued will be different, though. I mean, one difference we're already interestingly seeing, and that's that in 2016, the Russians didn't want Trump to win in the US election. They wanted Trump to make a nuisance and make Hillary a weaker president upon her election. That's not that it's not because they didn't prefer Trump to win. If he could have won, they felt he couldn't win. So they bought the centrist US political delusion. They were with the New York Times in this respect. Now, not to overgeneralize about that important journalistic institution, but today, my analysis is clear, at least at the level of the key figures in Putin's regime and Putin himself. They prefer Trump to win. So Trump is not a nuisance-making candidate for them. He's a candidate they prefer to win. Dmitry is quickly asking me if I think some of the what I think of the accusation against some of the recent films by the Navalny organization that they're themselves a mode of Kremlin-style propaganda. No. I'm aware of that. I will be commenting on that more, but they're not. They're just doing what they're trying, what they feel they need to do. To position themselves advantageously at a time when what they feel they can do is so limited. I think talking about Adam Curtis's take on Russian propaganda and the failure of Western individuals, maybe that's something I've done. Perhaps it's a bit too big to bite off now. But this topic is meaningful. The failure of various bits of Western political culture, Western political institutions. That's an important conversation, at least from this cartoonish point of view, this cartoonish concern, which starts with the idea that something is wrong. There's a tendency in our culture to think that the people who feel that something is wrong with our politics are just ignorant and they're irrational. They've bought various kinds of post-truth propaganda. But I don't think so. I think something really is wrong with our politics. That was on the cards 20 years ago, but wasn't expressed yet. And so we've got to have an important conversation about the diagnosis of the illness. Now, I've done that a little bit myself by talking about some of the patterns of democratic decline. And we'll do that a bit more. But I do believe that Western democracy is chronically sick. This is not a little bump or a couple of negative aberrations that we're encountering. We're not experiencing a terminal illness here, but as Putin thinks we are, but we're experiencing a chronic illness without a prospect of cure. Pool is asking a question that I struggle with. If empathy is akin to woke culture, no, empathy has nothing to do with woke culture, I'm afraid. in the critical sense in which I see it. If empathy is akin to woke culture, is Trumpism akin to Machiavellian sensible economics? Trumpianism is not akin to anything systematically sensible and not akin to anything Machiavellian, because Trumpianism is about Trump. And a central feature of Trump is his incapacity for sustained, disciplined political action outside of the mode of political communication. Now, you might argue that Trump is an expression, a very flawed, and for us, we might say a luckily flawed expression of the post-truth destructive anti-democratic populist. Could you argue that these people are more Machiavellian? Yes. But Trump is an imperfect version of them. He's a version of them in communication, but not a version of them behind closed doors. So I'm failing miserably at saying anything helpful about your question, partly because I'm a bit lost with it. But I think historically, my prediction is that the period we're still living through of buffoons, post democratic or anti-democratic political buffoons, will be replaced by a period of more hard-nosed and disciplined actors who take their place and also want to destroy democracy, but in a much more patient way and in a much more systematic way and in a much less short-term self-serving way, but albeit, of course, in a long and medium-term self-serving way. What part does the mainstream corporate media play with its attempts at perceived neutrality while missing the real dangers in the information sphere? This is very different between different countries, and arguably there's more problems with mainstream media in the US than elsewhere, in being sort of detached from the political reality the country is drifting into. But what I would say is that it's very important in a period where there's a crisis of trust, for institutions that claim to represent the entire country and speak to the entire country to really do so and not push a progressive agenda that hasn't persuaded most of the population as though it has. It's entirely reasonable to try to persuade the population of certain kinds of progressive agenda, but it's entirely inappropriate to act as though you've already done that when you haven't. So that's a very, very important part of how I see institutions acting. And that's, if you like, institutions being a bit more critical toward the latest progressive fashions. But there's also such a thing as institutions being critical toward the latest, even more destructive fashions on the right. And that means actually calling out not just lies, but post-truth rhetoric for what it is. And at the moment, institutions do not have a capacity to do that. The BBC does not have the capacity, does not have the correct approach for the differentiation, let us say, of Boris Johnson from Rishi Sunak, the current UK Prime Minister, who is arguably a political entrepreneur, but is not an overt post-truth anti-democratic populist. And so institutions have no way of making these distinctions, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that's fixable in my view, but it's a problem. maybe not a question about propaganda. I'll take it quickly. Is it possible for people in Putin's circle to step down from their jobs? No, it's not. It's just not. You can retire for very significant health reasons. And that is why partly Shoigu may be relieved at having ended up in this somewhat amorphous role of head of the Security Council, because it's a role that gives him a little less political power today than being defense minister, but gives him a little bit more safety. But no, they're on the submarine, they can't leave. If people from inside the Putin regime simply try to leave, it would be a threat to their life. For example, if Mr. Medvedev tried to move out of Russia and lead a non-political life, that would pose an immediate physical threat to his survival. Malfitano and Rachel, thank you so much for doing work that that fills in holes in my capacity to follow the feed. Ivan, practical question: as a result of Russian propaganda, the Azov brigade is not allowed to receive American equipment. How do you undo narratives like this? Well, I'm not an expert on the transformation of the Azov brigade, but what I do know is that there was a very significant transformation. So the Azov of more recent times is not the Azov of before. And generally, this leads to the bigger question about Russian propaganda about Ukraine, which is how far this story of hard right quasi-fascist politics or just outright fascist politics that is attributed by Russia to Ukraine, how that story pans out. In practice, of course, that story is false. Cumulatively speaking, I do think Ukraine has a cataclysmic corruption problem. And so some narratives in that direction are substantive. But this sort of fascist type radicalization narrative is just false. It's not representative of the Ukrainian polity on the whole. But we're back to actors in Western domestic politics who find it useful to exploit that narrative. And in doing so, they're not servicing Russia, they're servicing their own political interests. And what we have is just a sort of truck that's stuck with its wheels stuck in the mud. We can't make any progress against factual errors or what I would call minimally interpretive errors, right? How far a country has an extreme hard right problem is an interpretive question, but on certain measures it is a question with a big factual dimension. In other words, you can fairly well agree if you're legitimately trying to make sense of a situation on what is and what isn't a big problem in this respect. And Ukraine's okay. So this is basically a lie, cumulatively speaking, and it's a lie that is functionally useful to a lot of actors in the West, and they'll keep using it. And what is interesting is that even on YouTube, a lot of center-left and left content makers have also over milked on that message. So, for instance, the beautiful Kyle Kulinski, who is a left-wing YouTube commentator, he doesn't know much about Ukraine or Russia, to be fair, but Kyle has bought into this a little bit because of the way this has been in the wash. So it's difficult to challenge this because it's meeting the needs, it meeting the exploitative needs of a lot of people in the West has also persuaded a lot of utterly innocent commentators in the West to somewhat buy into that narrative. Roz, happy Sunday and thank you. Hi, beautiful Vlad. Russian propaganda calls for the use of tactical nuclear weapons appear to be swaying even average Russian citizens. Do you think this is more of Putin's nuclear blackmail strategy or a real concern, sending many well wishes and lots of love? Lots of love back at you. So if we look at the recent polls, and we shouldn't overvalue polls in Russia because the conditions aren't adequate for a lot of the normal polling activities. But the Russian population is very strongly against the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And the recent Russian field poll put that at about 70%. Wouldn't like Putin to do it if Putin thought he needed to. And that is why I agree also with my beautiful colleague on and off YouTube, Anders Bak-Nielsen, who emphasizes the domestic regime security issues of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That's to say, using non-strategic nuclear weapons rather in Ukraine for Putin would be a greater destabilization than the first wave of mobilization was. And Putin knows that. It doesn't mean he won't or he can't, but it means that there are really strong regime security reasons to not do that. And we sometimes don't hear enough about that. We often hear how China would be vehemently against it, which it would, and that might stop Putin. But we don't hear enough about what a regime security concern it would be for Putin to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and how far it would force them to politicize the Russian population ahead of the population's readiness to get politicized, even as the Kremlin conceive it. So it would be a big sort of spike into the wheel of Putin's bike here in his balancing act between politicizing and depoliticizing the population to do this. He thinks that you can't really use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine unless you have a much more politicized population than the population you've got now. What I would warn against is military experts coming along and thinking that they have an exhaustive analysis to give on the odds of this, because the Putin regime is not bureaucratically procedural the way a Western country is, in which you can't imagine the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons if all military expertise relates to the political leadership, but there is no military function in it. There being no military function in the use of non-tactical, non-strategic nuclear weapons in Russia does not rule out Putin using it just to use it. So I am moderately reassured for now about it for the reason that it's a huge regime security deficit for Putin to go there. What I would say, however, is that I am against the online policing of agnostic attitudes about whether Putin will use nuclear weapons by pro-Ukraine activists, because it's not true and doesn't help Ukraine anyway. Because the truth is that Putin would be prepared to use nuclear weapons if he felt that his own regime was in an existential situation. And moreover, while of course Putin does not want global Armageddon, he is less close to it than the Soviet leaders were. So I don't want to exaggerate this risk, but I do want to say that in many ways, Biden and Brezhnev are in one box and Putin is in another. Putin is a much more mystically oriented, apocalyptically minded, quasi-theistic figure compared to Soviet leaders who could much more easily be boxed up in terms of a much more economics type model of rational choice in the way they think about this. So again, I don't think the use of nuclear weapons is something that happens overnight. We'd get a sense that risk is going up. Risk is in the short term, I would guess, very low. But what I'm not comfortable to say is that that could never change. And I am myself more worried about the readiness of that regime to ride roughshod over certain kinds of breaks that were there in place with the Soviet leaders when it comes to global nuclear war. Doesn't mean the risks are high. They're not high, they're very low, but very low is higher than we want, basically. And then in terms of the non-strategic use of nuclear weapons, the key thing I would emphasize is how much of a threat it is to Putin's regime security. I hope that helps. So we're sleeping comfortably at the moment, but we're not taking that question and just throwing out of the window as though it could never be a live concern. And of course, it remains a live concern for the Biden administration because an avoidance of nuclear escalation is right at the heart of their Ukraine policy still. Arguably more than it needs to be, is what a lot of experts would argue, but it's certainly still very much at the heart of it. Do I follow Christopher Miller's reporting? Yeah, a bit. Don't have anything to say in particular. We're going to go an hour and a half, so we've still got plenty of time, and I'm very grateful that you're taking some time on Sunday. Rachel's making a comment about Kyle Kulinski, who is indeed a sweetheart. What I would say that is a structural problem for shows like Kyle's show or for Breaking Points with Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball is that whether you agree or disagree with what they're saying or how they're saying it, you can reasonably expect them to know a lot about their own country, but not having enough foreign pillars to rely on means it's a structural problem for shows like that to comment on foreign affairs because they're non-institutionalized shows, especially when it comes to giving news about foreign affairs. I don't believe a show like that can give any news about foreign affairs. It can give an opinion, but the problem with giving any news is that these people just cannot have, in virtue of how they're organized, a reporter on the ground. And that means that there's a very big epistemic gap between what they say about their domestic politics and what they say about foreign politics. And I mean that very bluntly. In other words, if you ask, if we focus on breaking points, if you ask Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty 100 questions about US domestic politics, factual questions, they're going to do really well. You begin asking them factual questions about Ukraine and Russia, or about Gaza for that matter, or about China, right? We're going to run into a very limited extent of knowledge, and so there's a kind of a structural problem there with commentary on foreign affairs by these kinds of shows. And so one of the consequences of this is that for better or worse, and in different ways, depending whether somebody is left or right or center or up or down politically, they end up over casting a particular issue in a part of the world in terms of US domestic politics. Um, and the United States is enormously powerful. Indeed, I call the United States an empire. And a good litmus test for this is that so many countries' fates are decided in the US capital. It's not an empire in every conventional sense, and that's why I think for me, it's an open terminological matter. For some people, it's congenial to call it an empire. For others, it's not. And in fact, somebody who calls the US an empire, and somebody who doesn't might still agree about that they're talking about the same thing. But I call the US an empire, and the United States is enormously influential. But there is a risk of, if you like, domestic narcissism, not personal narcissism, but just domestic narcissism, being overly present in the way we talk about foreign policy. Because if you know 50 times more about US domestic politics than you do about a particular crisis on the other part of the world, you're gonna discuss that crisis too much in US domestic politics terms. Is the pervasiveness of propaganda's effectiveness skewed toward one demographic more than others? Yes, the central demographic it's skewed toward is the demographic that is losing trust in its institutions. So the people who are most vulnerable to Russian propaganda are the people who are, for domestic and organic reasons, if you like, feeling some of these four central emotions of distrust, of which the fourth is the most central. Sorry about this thing. I need to remove it, and I haven't quite got around to doing that. The thumbs up thing that happens. But what we're talking about are people who are feeling unsafe with their institutions, people who are feeling powerless, people who are feeling betrayed, and above all, people who are feeling that their institutions are opaque. And people who experience viscerally these emotions, especially number four, are the ones who are most vulnerable if we're talking about individual citizens. And then, of course, you could say at an utterly individual level, you are obviously less vulnerable if you are really well mannered and well habituated in how to negotiate the information space. And that is harder than ever because, quite frankly, I think for virtually nobody in this room is it possible to say, I'm going to read 2 newspapers and just get all my information that way. That's not possible today. And so you need to have your own curation and also your own habits, including habits around challenging your own echo chamber. And so people who have, if you like, slightly better musculature and go to the epistemic gym a bit more often are, of course, less vulnerable. Econ is saying Putin is not mystical. He just uses that idea to manipulate. You're wrong. You're flat wrong. And it's very, very significant that you're flat wrong. But you're right, mostly if you look at Putin from 99 till 2010, perhaps. You're not right since then. You're not right about Putin. You're not right about the Kovalchuk brothers. You're not right about Patrushev. I mean, you're really, really, really scarily not right. I mean, you're just not getting the kind of animal this is. Sorry, I'm being so intransigent here. But I think it matters. Know thy enemy. Patrick is asking a question about how the education system has been affected in Ukraine. And that's something that several people would be able to say much better than I can. And Jade McGlynn perhaps would be able to speak particularly well about that. Out of epistemic humility, I must stay out. I do think, Roz, that, and yes, I appreciate that Canadians would be sympathetic with me here, that US political culture is especially prone to narcissism. And I don't mean individual narcissism, I mean sort of US centric narcissism, and is especially prone to illusion more than European democracies. At the same time, by sensibility, and people might discover this if they watch enough of me, I'm pro-American culturally. I think it's a sort of a limitlessly extraordinary, with all of its extravagances, culture, which I can spend some time criticizing for the narcissism, for the delusion, for the sometimes nauseatingly misplaced optimism, but it's also limitlessly amazing. So I'm pro-American. I'm culturally pro-American. Thank you, Patrick, very much. Stop scamming, man. Hello, back your way. Thank you for being here. No comment. I'm trying to stick us to the topic of Russian propaganda. No comment on the Iranian president's helicopter accident. From me, I'm so sorry to say. Riku, love back your way. From a hot summer's day, pretty much in London today. Riku is talking about in Finland being in the, sort of vaccinated against Russian propaganda in the 70s and 80s. The difference, of course, being that Russian propaganda today is largely post-truth propaganda, but Russian propaganda in the past, the sort of propaganda I grew up with in the Soviet Union, was alternate reality propaganda. Go ahead and believe this instead, please, because it's true. And Russian propaganda today says, don't believe anything we say. Don't believe anything anybody says. Don't believe anything. And the stuff they pump toward us will remain like that, we anticipate. But in Russia, over the last 2 years, it's now swung from being 100%, virtually 100% post-truth propaganda, to being 70% post-truth propaganda and 30% again alternate reality propaganda. increasingly that sliver of 30% will grow. And that's the regime telling the people, subscribe to our ideology, please. Well, whereas before, they were saying, believe in nothing. So they'll keep pumping post-truth at us, but in Russia, they're now blending 30% alternate reality with 70% post-truth, and it's going to be 35% alternate reality and 65% post-truth in Russia a year from now. So, and it'll get to 50-50 the way it's going. That's part of the politicization of society. Dan the man, how bothered do you think the Putin regime types or the Z-oriented propaganda folks feel about the win of Usyk over Tyson Fury? I don't think they feel much about that because they dislike both the UK and Ukraine. I didn't watch it. I don't buy what are these called? I've got a brain block. Pay-per-view boxing matches. But I saw some highlights, and Usyk did indeed win, contrary to the opinion of one of the three judges. Russell is absolutely right. Russell Whiskey is absolutely right that AI will supercharge propaganda campaigns. And what we're going to have in particular over the next few months and couple of years in the West is that the mess AI could play with our electoral processes will run ahead of our capacity to figure out what's going on and regulate it. So we're in a kind of AI mediated electorally vulnerable period at the moment. And you're absolutely right to emphasize this. My speculation on Putin's day-to-day life. Putin is exhausted with his job. He prefers to work less rather than more when the opportunity arises. He fantasizes about not being there, but is now resigned to the fact that there's no way for him to leave. And he has this sense of mission as well that is mystical and uncomfortable. He is less instinctively hardworking than the most hardworking Western political leaders, but obviously in that job he will be working more than somebody with an ordinary job. But he is not one of those naturally hardworking people, and he is maniacally obsessed not just with his health, but with every millimeter that he possibly can to extend his lifespan. He really takes a professional approach to lifespan expansion, sadly for us. And he'll be getting, infinitely greater health monitoring than a Western leader would. Indrid Cole, this is the only shirt I own. I own about 30 shirts, but they look pretty much the same. Nico is saying, I'm surprised we haven't got into the discussion of Margarita Simonyan, one of the most odious Russian propagandists. I think she might have a bigger section of sincerity in the pie chart of her motivations than some others. Solovyov much more transparently knows that he is lying. But of course, lying so endlessly and so functionally means you become convinced of your own lies to a good extent too. But there is I do think, a clear part inside Mr. Solovyov which is the part of a fairly liberally minded person who has had to asphyxiate that fairly liberal part to make do in the current course he is taking. Evgeny, who I think is often very critical of my content, is asking whether I have any comments about how the Russians will be using the illegitimacy argument on Zelensky because of the lack of elections in Ukraine. The answer is yes, but I don't think this is a significant issue because the Kremlin casts Zelensky as simply a puppet of the West. So the messaging about his legitimacy is secondary for the Russians because they think Ukraine itself is politically ephemeral and Ukraine's political leadership is itself politically ephemeral. They're just dealing with a sort of awkward stick that Washington has stuck into their side. That's their view. And so you analyze Washington, not the stick itself. Zonko, I don't know what kind of psychotherapy you need to go to for having a crush on Margarita Simonyan, but she's behaving very badly. And as a moral philosopher, forgetting the political issue of legal responsibility, I think that what she's doing is a very significant moral crime rather than a moral misdemeanor. In other words, I do think that these propagandists are very deeply, badly culpable. Just because they haven't, done anything physically violent themselves does not mean they're not very deeply culpable. Roderick is asking a question, but Roderick, you should ask the question in a single comment, otherwise I lose the second part of your comment. Evgeny, pleasure. But again, I mean, I do think that it is an effective Kremlin tool to point out that there hasn't been an election in Ukraine. So I don't want to belittle that propaganda tool. But the biggest Kremlin perspective, of course, is that, quite rightly, as in not agreeing with it, but I am representing it, that it's an accurate representation of it, to say that there's just very little political agency in Ukraine. This is just an imperial US attack on Russia's vital interests. Roderick, you're talking about NATO expansion. I give my view on NATO expansion, I think, in the video on the main channel about the collapse of the liberal global order, as I call it. Somebody who's very strong on the issue of NATO expansion is Mary Sarot. She's marvelous and really, really strong on the issue. On NATO expansion, you have to distinguish it I don't want to get into this too much, but you have to distinguish it being a central factor versus it being a factor that is not central but present. And you also have to distinguish whether the Russians are faking being exercised by it, whether they're genuinely exercised by it, and not to confuse these two. Um, Billy says we can stop entertaining that part of the argument about NATO. No, the legitimate academic debates about this, and certainly my views that NATO expansion was handled horrifically, absolutely horrifically. The question is what alternatives are there? But the idea of ventilating, welcoming Ukraine into NATO without welcoming it into NATO is a significant political own goal. Now, what Mary Surratt argues is that there could have been a much more success if the Partnership for Peace, the more graded way of entering NATO, was sustained, which it couldn't be for various reasons, including reasons of US domestic politics. This is an important issue, and it's just inappropriate online activism to try to close the NATO issue. It's a very interesting issue, but we need to discuss it responsibly and allow experts to talk about different possibilities. I mean, another possibility that experts talk about is fully taking NATO all the way to Russia's borders straight away after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think the historian Brendan Sims talks about that. So there are many, many possibilities to discuss, and no, therefore we can't close this issue. It's important to keep discussing it. Jason, Ukraine has only officially recognized 31,000 soldiers killed in action, while claiming Russia has killed 50,000. What are your thoughts on Western democratic propaganda? Well, Ukraine's going to be doing propaganda because Ukraine's at war. What do I think about that? I think that there are lots of fantastic military experts in the West who give a really good picture. And I do not think Western governments parrot what Ukraine is saying. So I mean, I don't see what it will even look like for Ukraine to not engage in propaganda. Sometimes Ukraine can engage in counterproductive propaganda that might help the Kremlin. There's certainly been instances of that. But when you're in existential war, you do propaganda to minimize your chances of losing an existential war. I mean, sometimes it's better to not drift too far from the realms of plausibility, because that can also undermine trusting. This is a difficult balance to strike. But this is really a conversation about Ukraine's strategy in information environment. Yeah, I mean, Russia's lies are especially fantastic about casualties, but both sides in a conflict will not be truthful in how they represent casualties. But the Russians are really out there. I mean, the trouble is that politically, the Russians are nowhere near their threshold of casualties they can afford to lose. LC Caldero is asking, can Russia be a polar center of economic and geopolitical power in a post-war world like the USSR was? Russia is in real trouble. Part of reducing the enormous amount of trouble that Russia is going to be in over the next decades, for the whole world, in fact, is to think of sustainable arrangements for the ex-Soviet space and for the East European space that also reckon with Russia's security needs. The temptation to say Russia doesn't have any security needs we need to reckon with because they're just a very malign, murderous invader in an unprovoked war, sure. But we're going to have to eventually reckon with Russia's security needs to some extent. And what the role of the Russian opposition is that they're not doing is to articulate for Russians and for Russia a set of non-imperialistic, normal security needs that are alternatives to what we've got now. So that's an important conversation. I think the Russian opposition are not doing enough because they're scared of talking about Russia's national interest in any way at all. But in fact, how are you going to persuade the army to be on board with you if you are Navalny's organization? How are you going to persuade many of the apparatuses of the state to be on board with you? How are you going to persuade the majority of demographics in that country to be with you? Unless you say, hey guys, we did this really horrific war, but at the same time, we're going to guarantee your security in this and that way by responsibly and fairly dealing with the West and victims of our own imperialism. So that's an important conversation. But in terms of the regeneration of Russia as a significant power after the war, I don't know exactly in what light you want to cast this, but the medium-term prognosis for Russia is really poor, no matter how this war pans out. Nico is talking about the implementation of the sort of Chinese-style firewall to increase the efficacy of Russian propaganda at home. They are trying to do more, but they're reflecting on their capacity and they're reflecting on the downsides. But they are certainly keen to shut down YouTube if they can, which they've not done yet. So, beautiful community, we've had a little bit of a chat, and we'll be in touch on the chat channel a few times before the main channel propaganda video, because with my health it'll take me a while to do it. But I'm going to try to give us a kind of guide to the toxic patterns of Russian propaganda as they impact the West, specifically about how they impact us, not Russians. And I have faith that's going to be of some use. Meanwhile, thank you so much for being with me. Have a really good rest of Sunday. And we're going to be connected very soon. Amalfitano, thank you. Grant, thank you. Jessica, thank you. I'm grateful to you all. And talk soon. Bye-bye.